Hello everyone, I'm the storyteller, here to lead you through tonight's chilling journey. If you find these stories help you unwind or gently guide you to sleep, consider supporting the channel by liking this video and subscribing if you haven't already. It truly helps bring more of these stories to you. Also, I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and the time where you are. It's always fascinating to connect with listeners around the world. So, take a deep breath, settle in, and prepare yourself for a night of mystery and suspense. Moving into a new neighborhood is never easy, especially when you're young and new to town. My parents had chosen a quiet suburban area far from the bustling city, hoping for a peaceful life. Our house was modest but charming, nestled at the beginning of a cul-de-sac. The only other house on the street was at the very end, a massive, dark structure that looked out of place amidst the modern homes. From the moment we arrived, the house gave me the creeps. Its shutters hung askew, the paint was peeling, and the yard was overgrown with weeds. But what unsettled me most was the family that lived there. The Carsons, as the neighbors called them, were strange. The father, Mr. Carson, was tall and thin, with sunken cheeks and a perpetual frown. Mrs. Carson was always dressed in old-fashioned clothes, her face blank and emotionless. They had 3 children, all eerily quiet and pale, like they never saw sunlight. The Carsons rarely came outside during the day, but at night you could sometimes hear faint laughter or see dim lights flickering in their windows. When they did venture out, they moved slowly, deliberately, as though every step was calculated. My parents told me not to worry. Every neighborhood has its quirks, my mom said. But something about the Carsons felt wrong. One evening, while I was walking home from a friend's house, I saw one of the Carson children standing at the edge of their yard. It was the youngest, a boy who couldn't have been more than 8 years old. He stared at me with wide, unblinking eyes. "Hi," I said hesitantly. He didn't respond. Instead, he raised his hand and pointed toward my house. Chilled, I quickened my pace and didn't look back until I was safely inside. The next day, my mom told me we were invited to dinner at the Carsons' house. I protested, but she insisted it was rude to decline. Their home was even creepier on the inside. The air was musty, the furniture outdated, and the walls were lined with strange old photographs. Most of them were black and white portraits of unsmiling people, but there was something off about the faces, distorted, like the photos had been warped over time. Dinner was uncomfortable. The Carsons barely spoke, and when they did, it was in short, clipped sentences. The children sat perfectly still, their hands folded neatly in their laps. "Do you like the neighborhood?" Mrs. Carson asked abruptly, her voice sharp and mechanical. "Yes," my mom replied nervously. "It's very quiet." Mrs. Carson smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Good. Quiet is best." After dinner, Mr. Carson offered to show me their collection in the basement. I didn't want to go, but my parents thought it was polite, so I reluctantly followed him down the creaky wooden stairs. The basement was dimly lit and smelled of mildew. Shelves lined the walls, filled with glass jars. At first, I thought they were empty, but as I got closer, I realized each jar contained something small and shriveled. Fingers, ears, even eyes. I stumbled back, my heart racing. "Do you like them?" Mr. Carson asked, his tone devoid of emotion. I didn't respond. I just mumbled something about needing to use the bathroom and bolted back upstairs. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the jars, the children's eerie stillness, and the way Mrs. Carson's smile felt like a mask. Around midnight, I heard a sound outside my window, a soft tapping. I froze, my heart pounding. Slowly I turned to see one of the Carson children standing in my yard, staring up at me. They didn't move, didn't speak. They just stood there, their head tilted slightly, as though studying me. I shut the blinds and stayed under my blankets until morning. The next day, I told my parents everything. My mom said I was overreacting, but my dad seemed uneasy. He promised to talk to the Carsons, but when he went to their house, no one answered the door. A week passed, and the Carsons seemed to vanish. Their house was dark, the yard untouched. Curious, I ventured into their yard one afternoon and peered through a window. The house was empty, completely barren. as though no one had lived there in years. I never saw the Carsons again, but sometimes at night I still hear faint laughter drifting from the end of the street, and when I walk past their house, I feel eyes watching me from the shadows, waiting. When I first adopted Max, a big golden retriever, I never expected him to change my life. I just wanted a dog to keep me company. I lived alone in a small house on the outskirts of town, and the loneliness sometimes crept in. So, when I saw the ad for a free dog at the local shelter, I jumped at the opportunity. Max was a calm, affectionate dog, always wagging his tail and ready for cuddles. He would follow me around the house, settle by my feet when I worked, and play in the yard whenever I threw a ball. Everything seemed perfect, but then strange things started happening. It started one evening when I was working late in my study. I was typing away at my computer when I heard a soft scratching sound at the door. Thinking it was Max wanting to go outside, I opened the door and was greeted by his excited wagging tail. I smiled, letting him out into the yard, and then went back to work. But Max didn't go far. I could hear him whining, scratching at the door and pacing around. "Max, stop," I called, annoyed. "Go to the bathroom and relax." I opened the door, expecting to see him standing by it, but he wasn't there. There was no sign of him in the hallway or the yard. That's when I noticed something. The back door, which I always locked at night, was slightly ajar. I never left the door unlocked. Ever. My stomach sank as I rushed to check the locks, but there was no sign of forced entry. Max was nowhere to be found. It wasn't until later that night when things started getting really strange. I was sitting in the living room watching TV, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling of Max being out of my sight. Suddenly I heard him. His soft whining was coming from the hallway, followed by the unmistakable sound of his paws padding across the floor. I froze. Max was outside. I quickly stood up and rushed into the hallway, my pulse quickening. There he was, standing at the end of the hall, staring at me. His golden fur looked almost dark in the low light. His eyes were wide, reflecting something in the dim glow. But it wasn't just a look of excitement or affection. It was fear. "Max?" I called softly. He didn't move. That's when I saw it. A shadow, tall, thin, and with an unnatural stillness, moved just behind him, barely visible against the dark hallway wall. The figure didn't cast a shadow on the floor. It was as if it didn't belong in the world. I took a step back, my heart racing in my chest. But before I could react, Max bolted past me and ran into the living room, whining loudly. I followed him, terrified. For the next few nights, things got worse. Max wouldn't stop barking at the hallway, staring at the door as if someone or something was on the other side. He refused to go outside, even for his walks. Every time I tried to leave the house, he would block the door, growling low in his throat. One night I stayed up late, watching Max from the couch. He was lying down, but his eyes were wide open, fixed on the door. He was trembling. "Max, what's wrong?" I whispered, kneeling beside him. He let out a low growl, his gaze never leaving the door. And then I heard it. A soft tap, like someone gently knocking on the door. I froze, my blood running cold. There was no one else in the house. I hadn't heard anyone approach. Max stood up, his body tense. He growled again, louder this time, and looked back at me. I slowly approached the door, my hand shaking as I reached for the knob. I opened it, expecting to see nothing. But the yard was dark and still, the trees swaying lightly in the breeze. Nothing. The nights grew longer, and Max became more agitated. He would wake me up in the middle of the night, barking furiously at the corner of the room, his fur standing on end. He wouldn't stop until I turned on all the lights. And then, one night, everything changed. I woke up to a loud crash, something breaking in the house. I leapt out of bed and ran downstairs, my heart hammering in my chest. Max was standing at the base of the stairs, barking furiously at the living room. I ran into the room, my eyes scanning for the source of the noise. The window was shattered, and the curtains were blowing wildly in the wind. But what caught my attention wasn't the broken glass. It was the figure standing near the window. A tall, dark silhouette with glowing eyes. Max was at my side now, growling louder than ever, but he wouldn't move toward the figure. It was like he was paralyzed by fear. The figure didn't move. It didn't make a sound. It just stood there watching me. I grabbed Max's collar, pulling him back into the hallway. My hands were shaking, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The figure didn't follow. It didn't have to. That night, I packed up everything and left. I couldn't stay in that house anymore. Max and I moved to a new town, to a new place, far away from whatever had been haunting us. But sometimes, at night, when the house is too quiet, I hear the scratching, the tapping, the sound of paws on the floor just outside the door, and I wonder, if I look closely enough, will I see those glowing eyes watching me from the darkness again? It was supposed to be an ordinary night. I had just finished a long day of work and was finally relaxing at home, scrolling through Reddit. The community there had always been a source of amusement for me, especially the creepy threads, the ones where people shared their scariest experiences. Little did I know, that night would be the start of something I would never forget. It all started with a post that caught my attention. The title read, "I think I'm being watched." It wasn't particularly new or popular, but the cryptic nature of the title piqued my curiosity. I clicked on the thread, which was filled with chilling accounts from the poster, who went by the username GhostHunter42. The story began with a simple experience. The user had noticed strange activity happening around their house, shadows in the corner of their vision, doors that seemed to creak open on their own, and a growing sense of unease. Nothing that couldn't be explained away, they thought. But then, things started escalating. The poster recounted how they began receiving messages from an anonymous account, one that had no profile picture, no posts, no followers. Just a blank page with the username, Watchful Eye. The first message was simple enough. "I see you." At first, the poster shrugged it off, thinking it was some prankster or a random bot. But the messages kept coming, each one more unsettling than the last. "I'm watching you right now. I know where you are." Soon they began to notice something even stranger. The messages would come at times when they had just thought of the username or the words themselves. It was like the person on the other end of the screen knew what they were thinking. One night, the poster decided to respond, asking who this was and why they were getting these messages. But the response was chilling. "I'm closer than you think." The user didn't respond after that. Instead, they logged off and tried to forget about it. But things only got worse. The post continued. GhostHunter42 described how they started hearing noises in the house late at night, scraping sounds coming from the walls, a faint tapping on the windows, and the constant feeling of being watched. The messages from Watchful Eye kept appearing, more frequent and more personal. "I know you're alone. Don't look out the window." One evening, while alone at home, the user finally did look out the window, and that's when things took a terrifying turn. They saw a figure standing at the edge of their yard, motionless, staring directly at them. The person was dressed in dark clothes, and their face was hidden in shadow. But what struck them the most were the eyes, glowing faintly in the darkness, just like the words on the screen. The poster said they froze, unable to look away, before the figure slowly turned and disappeared into the woods behind their house. It was at that moment that the messages stopped. The account Watchful Eye no longer sent any new texts. It was as if they had disappeared into thin air. Reading all of this sent a cold shiver down my spine. I scrolled through the rest of the thread, desperate for answers, when something odd happened. The comments seemed to stop coming in. Normally, Reddit threads would fill up with replies, but there were only a few responses. One user replied, "Dude, this is seriously creepy, but I think you should report it to the authorities." Another said, "This is all just some elaborate prank. Don't let it get to you." But there was one comment that made my blood run cold. "I had the same experience. His eyes are always watching." The comment came from a new user, Watcher96, who had only created their account moments before posting. The reply was short, but the chilling implication was enough to send a wave of fear over me. I went back to Ghost Hunter 42's profile, hoping for some kind of closure, but their account had disappeared. The post was still there, but their username was no longer clickable. It was as though they had wiped themselves off the face of Reddit. I couldn't sleep that night. The whole story was rattling around in my mind, and I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched, just like the poster had been. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just a story, but something about it felt too real. That's when it started. The notifications. I had no idea who was messaging me, but I started getting strange notifications on Reddit. At first, they were just like any other. Updates on threads I had subscribed to, some spam, a few replies to my comments. But then I saw a notification from Watchful Eye. I froze. It was a direct message. The notification preview was short. I see you. I didn't open the message. I couldn't. My heart raced as I locked my phone and shoved it in my drawer. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing little noises, scraping, tapping, just like the poster had described. I lay there in bed, too scared to move, staring at the darkness around me. Every so often I'd glance at my phone, but it remained silent. But then, just as I started to nod off, my phone vibrated. The screen lit up, and a new message appeared from Watchful Eye. I'm outside. I jumped out of bed and looked through the window. Nothing. Just the empty street and the darkness stretching out before me. My heart pounded in my chest as I checked the door locks, the windows, everything. There was no sign of anyone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The next day, I deleted my Reddit account. I deleted every social media account I had. It was the only way I thought I could escape, to put distance between myself and whatever, or whoever, was watching me. But the memories of the posts and that message still haunt me. I never heard from Watchful Eye again, but every now and then, when I check my phone late at night, I wonder if it's lurking in the background, waiting to appear again. It was supposed to be an ordinary night in the university dorm. A group of friends, Jenna, Mia, and Leah, had just finished their exams and were looking forward to a weekend of relaxation. They decided to spend the evening in their shared dorm room, watching movies and talking about their plans for the future. But as the night wore on, something felt off. The dorm was located in one of the oldest buildings on campus, a place that had been around for decades. Its dark wooden floors creaked, and the walls were thick with the scent of age and history. The room they shared had 2 bunk beds and a small desk by the window, with a view of the campus courtyard. It was cozy, but there was always an eerie vibe to the place. At first, everything seemed normal. The girls chatted about their classes, the stressful exams, and their plans for the upcoming summer. They turned on the TV, deciding to watch a horror movie to set the mood. But as the night grew late, Jenna noticed something strange. The light in the hallway outside their door flickered intermittently. It was subtle at first, almost as if the bulb was about to burn out. But after a while, the flickering became more frequent. Every few seconds, the light would flicker on and off, casting strange shadows across the walls. "Did anyone else see that?" Jenna asked, pointing at the light. Leah shrugged. "Probably just a faulty bulb. It happens sometimes." Mia, who had been absorbed in her phone, didn't seem to pay much attention. But Jenna couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The light had never flickered like that before, and it was starting to give her a sinking feeling in her stomach. Around midnight, the girls decided to turn off the TV and get some sleep. But as Jenna lay in bed, trying to close her eyes, she heard something unusual. It was a soft, rhythmic tapping sound, like someone gently knocking on a door. At first she thought it was just the old walls of the building settling, but then she realized it was coming from the hallway, directly outside their room. She held her breath, listening. The knocking continued, but it wasn't like any normal knock she had ever heard. It was deliberate, slow, almost as though whoever, or whatever was making it, was trying to get their attention. "Did you hear that?" Jenna whispered, her heart racing. Mia and Leah sat up in bed, their faces pale. "What was that?" Mia asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know, but I don't like it," Leah said, glancing nervously at the door. Jenna got up and quietly approached the door, her hand shaking as she reached for the doorknob. She slowly cracked the door open just a few inches, but to her shock, there was no one there. The hallway was empty, the dim, flickering light casting long shadows on the walls. There was nothing out of the ordinary, but the feeling of unease lingered in the air. Jenna closed the door quickly and locked it. "I don't know what that was, but I'm not going back out there," she said, her voice shaking. The girls tried to brush it off as a trick of the mind. They settled back into their beds, but the tapping sound continued, now louder and more urgent, almost as if it was trying to break through the door. Suddenly, the light in the hallway flickered once more, but this time it went out completely, plunging the entire floor into darkness. The girls froze in terror, not knowing what to do or where to go. The tapping grew louder, and then it stopped. There was a deafening silence that filled the room, making their ears ring. Then, the door to their room creaked open on its own. It wasn't a gust of wind. It wasn't the old hinges. The door opened slowly, with an eerie, unnatural force. The girls screamed and scrambled away from the door, their hearts pounding in their chests, but there was no one there. The room was empty, just as it had been moments before, but something was wrong. The air had grown colder, and the shadows in the room seemed to stretch unnaturally long. There was a heavy feeling in the air, as if something was watching them. That's when Mia noticed something in the corner of the room. It was a figure, barely visible in the dark, but she could make out the outline of a person standing there, motionless. "Mia, look," Leah whispered, her voice barely audible. Mia turned to follow her gaze, and her heart nearly stopped. The figure was there, standing in the corner, staring at them with hollow eyes. "No one's supposed to be here," Jenna whispered, her voice cracking with fear. The figure didn't move. It simply stood there, its hollow eyes fixed on them. The next morning, the girls were too terrified to leave their room. They locked the door and stayed inside, not even daring to open the window to let in the daylight. It wasn't until later in the afternoon that they finally gathered the courage to go down to the dorm's front desk and speak to the building's manager. The manager, an older woman with graying hair, listened to their story with a strange expression. "You saw her, didn't you?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. The girls exchanged confused glances. "Who?" "The woman in the corner," the manager said, her eyes wide. "She's been haunting this dorm for years. She was a student here a long time ago. She disappeared one night and no one ever found her. Some say she still roams these halls, looking for something, or someone." The girls never stayed in that dorm again. They moved out the very next day, leaving the building behind. But even now, when they walk past that old dormitory, they can't shake the feeling that the figure in the corner is still there, waiting for the next group of students to hear her knock, to see her standing in the dark. And no one knows what happened to her, or why she still lingers in the shadows of that place. But one thing is certain, the haunting of that dorm was far from over. I always loved the idea of working on a farm. Growing up in the city, I had spent countless days imagining what life must be like in the countryside, waking up to the smell of fresh hay, working with animals, and getting away from the noise and chaos of the urban life. When I saw an ad online for a farmhand position on a remote farm not too far from my town, I jumped at the opportunity. It seemed like a dream job. The farm was located at the end of a long, winding dirt road, surrounded by tall trees that almost seemed to close in on the path as you drove through. The owner, an elderly man named Mr. Crawford, greeted me warmly on the first day, explaining that the farm had been in his family for generations. He was getting older, and his health wasn't what it used to be, which is why he was looking for someone to help with the daily work. He lived alone in a large, dilapidated farmhouse, tucked away on the far side of the property. The house had a dark, weathered look to it, with cracked windows and overgrown vines crawling up the walls. The barn, however, was in much better shape, and that's where I spent most of my time, feeding the animals, mucking out the stalls, and performing the usual chores. For the first few days, everything went smoothly. Mr. Crawford would give me instructions in the morning, and I would work through the day, getting everything done. He was quiet but kind enough, and I had no reason to believe anything was amiss. However, as the days went on, I started to notice strange things. One evening, after finishing my chores, I was on my way back to the farmhouse when I heard something odd coming from the barn. It sounded like a faint, muffled voice. I stopped in my tracks and listened carefully, but the sound quickly stopped. Assuming it was just the wind or some animal making noise, I continued walking toward the house. But the next evening, the same thing happened again. I tried to brush it off as my imagination getting the best of me. Maybe it was just the wind, or maybe a stray animal had gotten into the barn and was making odd noises. But the more it happened, the more unnerving it became. One night, curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to investigate. After Mr. Crawford had gone to bed, I snuck back outside and made my way toward the barn. As I neared the door, I could hear the muffled voices again, but this time they were clearer. They sounded like whispers, low and unintelligible, as though someone was speaking in hushed tones just inside the barn. I stood there frozen for a moment, trying to decide what to do. Should I knock? Should I go inside? Part of me wanted to turn around and forget I had heard anything, but another part of me felt a strange pull to discover what was going on. With a deep breath, I slowly opened the barn door and stepped inside. The barn was dark, save for a dim light coming from a small room in the back. The air inside was heavy with the scent of hay and old wood, but there was something else, something musty, almost like mildew, lingering in the air. I could see shadows moving at the far end of the barn, and I cautiously walked closer. As I approached the light, I was able to make out figures. People standing in a circle around something on the floor. They were dressed in ragged clothes, their faces obscured in shadow. I couldn't make out any details, but the sight sent a chill down my spine. Before I could take another step, one of them turned toward me. I froze. The figure's face was pale, with hollow eyes and a twisted smile that made my stomach churn. Without a word, the figure slowly raised a hand and pointed at me. I backed away slowly, my heart pounding in my chest, and as I did, the others turned toward me, their eyes following my every movement. The whispers from before started again, louder this time, more insistent. They seemed to be speaking in some kind of chant, their voices rising in a rhythmic pattern. I turned and ran out of the barn, slamming the door behind me. My breath was coming in sharp gasps as I sprinted toward the house, not daring to look back. I didn't sleep that night. I spent the hours pacing in my room, wondering what the hell I had just witnessed. Was it a dream? Had I imagined it all? There had to be a rational explanation. But when I looked outside the window, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, in the middle of the field behind the barn, stood a figure. It was tall and shadowy, but it was unmistakably human, and it was looking directly at the house. I tried to tell myself it was just a trick of the light or a figment of my imagination, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. I knew I wasn't alone on that farm. The next morning, I confronted Mr. Crawford. I told him everything I had seen and heard the night before, the whispers, the figures, the strange ritual in the barn. At first he seemed taken aback, but then his expression hardened. He stared at me for a long moment before speaking. "You shouldn't have seen that," he said, his voice low. "That's something you're not supposed to know about. It's been happening for years, generations even. We have a tradition here, but you've gone and gotten yourself involved, and now it's too late." He paused, his eyes narrowing as if deciding whether to say more. Finally he spoke again, this time with a grim tone. "If you want to leave, you can, but be warned, they'll come after you. They won't let you leave so easily." I didn't know what he meant by that, but I didn't want to find out. I packed my things that afternoon, but as I was leaving, something caught my eye. The figure I had seen the night before was standing in the distance, watching me from the edge of the woods. I ran to my car, heart racing, and drove off, not stopping until I was miles away. I never returned to the farm again, but even now sometimes, when I'm alone late at night, I hear faint whispers on the wind, and I can't help but wonder if the farmhand's secret has followed me, wherever I go. In a small, secluded village, there stood an old house that had been abandoned for years. The townspeople spoke in hushed tones about the house, always avoiding its shadow. It was said to be haunted by a girl who never left. Most dismissed these stories as nothing more than old folklore, until one fateful night. A young woman named Claire moved into the village after inheriting the house from a distant relative. The house, though old and weathered, felt like a fresh start for her. She was new to the area and had no family or friends nearby, so the isolation didn't bother her. She spent her days cleaning and organizing the place, eager to make it feel like home again. There was one room, however, that Claire could never bring herself to enter. It was a small bedroom at the top of the stairs, the window of which was covered by thick yellowed curtains. The room felt cold, almost oppressive, and no matter how many times she tried to open the window to let in the sunlight, it wouldn't budge. One rainy afternoon, as the wind howled outside, Claire's curiosity grew too strong. She decided to enter the room. She moved toward the window and tried to pull back the curtains. The air in the room grew heavier, and her heart raced as if something were watching her. When the curtains finally parted, she gasped. Outside the window, beyond the overgrown garden, stood a girl. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow, and she wore a long, tattered white dress. She stood motionless, staring at Claire with an expression that was impossible to read. Claire's breath caught in her throat as she stepped back from the window, her mind racing. The girl outside didn't move. She just stood there, her cold gaze fixed on Claire's. That night, Claire struggled to sleep. The image of the girl outside the window lingered in her mind. She told herself it was just her imagination, maybe a trick of the light or some strange reflection. But deep down, she knew something wasn't right. The next morning, she returned to the window, but the girl was gone. Relieved, she went about her day, trying to put the incident behind her. However, every night after that, Claire couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. She would often wake up in the middle of the night to see the faint outline of a figure in the corner of her room, standing still and silent. A week later, on a particularly stormy night, Claire woke up to the sound of soft tapping against her window. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. It was the girl again, standing outside in the rain. This time, the girl's face was pressed against the glass, her eyes wide and unblinking, staring straight into Claire's soul. Her mouth opened slightly, as if trying to speak, but no sound came out. Terrified, Claire grabbed her phone to call for help. But when she looked back at the window, the girl was gone. Desperate for answers, Claire reached out to the local librarian, hoping to uncover the mystery behind the house. The librarian, an elderly woman with a stern expression, leaned in close when Claire mentioned the girl at the window. "You shouldn't have opened that room," she said softly. "That girl was once the daughter of the family that lived there long ago. She was always seen at that window, staring out, waiting for someone to come for her. But one night, she disappeared, and no one saw her again. They say her spirit is trapped there, forever longing for the world outside." Claire shuddered, feeling a chill run down her spine. That night, she decided to leave the house, convinced that something was terribly wrong. As she packed her belongings, she felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as though the very walls were closing in on her. Just as she was about to leave, she heard the faintest whisper, like a breeze against her ear. "Please, don't leave me alone," the voice said. Turning toward the window, Claire saw the girl once again, her face now pressed against the glass with a look of sorrow and desperation. But this time there was something else, an unsettling realization. The girl wasn't just staring out at the world. She was begging Claire to stay, to keep her company, to share the loneliness of the room. The window began to fog up as the girl's breath formed on the glass, and Claire saw something that made her blood run cold. The girl's reflection was no longer alone. Behind her, standing in the shadows, was another figure, tall, dark, and watching Claire with eyes that weren't hers. Claire turned to run, but before she could reach the door, the figure at the window began to move. It wasn't the girl anymore. The figure stepped back from the glass and, with one last mournful glance, vanished into the night. The house was empty again. But now, every night, the villagers would say they saw a girl standing at the window, gazing out into the storm, waiting for someone who would never come. Some even claimed they could hear the soft sound of footsteps behind them when walking past the house. Footsteps that were never there. It was a cold, foggy night when Jason found himself driving along the old highway. The roads were empty, save for the occasional flickering streetlight that cast long, eerie shadows across the asphalt. Jason had been driving for hours, trying to get home after visiting an old friend in a neighboring town. The journey had been longer than expected, and his eyes were growing heavy. He considered pulling over to rest, but something about the desolate stretch of road made him uneasy. He had heard the stories, of course, the tales about the highway, whispered among the locals for years. They spoke of drivers who disappeared without a trace, of cars that broke down mysteriously, of strange figures seen in the distance. Jason didn't believe in superstitions, though. He laughed it off as just another set of stories to pass the time in a small town. As the minutes dragged on, Jason's car sped down the road, the fog growing thicker. His headlights barely cut through the haze, and the world outside seemed to vanish into a ghostly void. He wasn't sure how long he had been driving, but the eerie silence pressing against him made him feel more and more isolated. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw a figure standing by the side of the road. A woman, her pale face barely visible in the dim light, stood motionless in the fog, her back to him. She was dressed in a long, tattered white dress, her hair disheveled and hanging in front of her face. Jason's heart skipped a beat. He slowed the car, hesitating for a moment. The woman didn't move, just stood there, as if waiting for him. Against his better judgment, he pulled over to the side of the road and rolled down his window. "Are you okay?" he called out, his voice almost drowned by the oppressive silence. The woman didn't respond. Instead, she turned slowly, her head jerking unnaturally, as though she had been listening for something. Jason's blood ran cold. Her eyes were wide open, but they were empty, like two black voids. There was no emotion in her face, no hint of recognition. She just stared at him, unmoving. "Do you need help?" Jason asked again, trying to keep his voice steady, though his hands gripped the wheel tightly. The woman's lips parted slightly, but she didn't speak. Instead, she pointed down the road, her finger trembling as if it took every ounce of her strength to move. Jason looked in the direction she was pointing. The fog had thickened even more, and the road stretched out before him, dark and endless. But in the distance, barely visible, he saw the faint outline of a car that wasn't there just moments ago. Jason's heart pounded in his chest. He should have driven away. He should have ignored the strange figure, but something about the way she pointed made him feel like he had no choice. The car in the distance seemed to beckon him. He stared at it for a moment, his mind racing with questions. "Are you sure you're all right?" Jason called again, but the woman didn't respond. She just stood there, her finger still pointing down the road. He felt a chill run down his spine as an unsettling thought crossed his mind. What if she wasn't real? What if she was a figment of his exhaustion, a hallucination brought on by the long drive? But the hair on the back of his neck stood up as he looked back at the woman. There was no mistaking her now. She was real. With a deep breath, Jason slammed the gear shift into drive and began to move forward, the car inching slowly down the road. As he passed the woman, she didn't move. She just stared at him, her eyes locked onto his, sending an icy shiver through him. As he neared the car in the distance, The fog began to lift, revealing more details. It was a dark sedan, its headlights dim, parked strangely in the middle of the road. No one was inside. Jason slowed the car to a stop, unsure of what to do. He checked the rearview mirror, but the woman was gone. Confused and slightly terrified, Jason sat in the car, unsure whether he should get out and check the abandoned vehicle. Then he heard something that made his blood run cold. A soft tapping on his window. His eyes widened in horror. Slowly he turned his head toward the sound. There, standing right beside his car, was the woman, her face pressed against the glass. Her empty eyes stared at him, her mouth open as though trying to speak, but no sound came. Her breath fogged up the window as she continued to stare at him, her hand resting against the glass as if trying to reach inside. Jason's heart pounded as he slammed the gas pedal, the car lurching forward as he sped away from the woman, not daring to look back. The road stretched out before him, but the weight of what he had just seen clung to him, like a shadow he couldn't escape. As the miles passed, the fog slowly began to clear, but the unease remained. Jason glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the woman following him, but the road behind him was empty. Suddenly, a voice broke the silence, a soft whisper that seemed to come from all around him. "You shouldn't have stopped." Jason's blood ran cold as he gripped the wheel tighter, his eyes darting around, but there was no one else on the road. The whisper echoed in his mind, filling him with dread. He looked ahead, and in the distance he saw another car, a car that looked exactly like the one he had passed earlier. But this time, he didn't stop. As he drove faster, the whispering grew louder until it was all he could hear, a cacophony of voices, all calling out to him, "You shouldn't have stopped." It wasn't until he reached his destination, hours later, that Jason realized something truly horrifying. His car, his clothes, even his breath, everything about him smelled like old stale air, like the inside of a forgotten room. And when he looked in the rearview mirror one last time, he saw the woman's face reflected in the glass, her empty eyes staring back at him. And that was when he realized it wasn't just a story, it was a warning. The highway had a way of pulling people in, never letting them leave. In a quiet town, nestled between dark, untamed forests and rolling hills, there stood an old house on the outskirts, abandoned for as long as anyone could remember. Locals spoke little of it, as it was shrouded in mystery. There was only one thing everyone knew for sure. No one who ventured near the house after dark ever returned the same. Lena, a young woman with an unyielding sense of curiosity, moved into the town one chilly autumn evening. She had just graduated college and was looking for a fresh start away from the city's hustle and bustle. When she arrived at the small town, she heard the whispers about the old house but shrugged them off as nothing more than superstitions. It didn't take long before she became intrigued by the house herself. The house was a massive, dilapidated structure, with ivy creeping up the cracked walls and windows covered by layers of dust and grime. Lena would often walk by it on her way to the grocery store, drawn to its mystery. One evening, after a particularly long walk, she stood outside the house, peering through a broken window. There was something about it that seemed alive. A strange sensation crawled up her spine. That night, Lena could not shake the feeling that she was being watched. Her sleep was restless, filled with strange dreams of someone screaming, but always just out of reach, as if trapped in another room. Days passed, and Lena's fascination with the house grew. She found herself walking closer to it every evening, almost against her will. Finally, unable to resist any longer, she decided to enter the house. The door creaked loudly as she pushed it open, sending a shiver down her spine. The air inside was thick and musty, the smell of old wood and decay lingering in the corners. The floorboards groaned under her weight as she stepped further inside. Her heart raced as she moved through the house, drawn toward the staircase. The walls were lined with faded photographs, some broken or torn, while others still hung intact, staring at her with haunting eyes. The deeper Lena ventured into the house, the stronger the feeling of being watched became. She paused at the base of the stairs, staring up at the dark, narrow hallway above. Then she heard it, a faint whisper, barely audible. like a soft breeze brushing against her ear. "Help me." The voice was weak, distant, but unmistakable. Her breath caught in her throat. "Is someone there?" she called out, her voice trembling. No answer came. The whispering grew louder, clearer, until it became a scream, high-pitched and desperate, echoing through the empty halls. "Help me, please!" the voice cried. Lena's heart thudded in her chest as she turned toward the source of the scream, which seemed to come from the very walls themselves. Against her better judgment, she climbed the stairs, drawn toward the sound. As she reached the top, the hallway stretched out before her, dark and narrow, with doors lining each side. The scream continued, louder now, frantic and filled with terror. She followed the sound to the last door on the right, which stood ajar. With a deep breath, Lena pushed the door open. Inside, the room was empty, except for a large antique mirror hanging on the wall. The scream suddenly stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. The air grew cold, and Lena shivered as she stepped closer to the mirror. The surface was covered in dust, but the reflection that stared back at her was not her own. It was the face of a woman, her eyes wide with terror, her mouth open in a silent scream. Lena stumbled backward, heart pounding in her chest. The face in the mirror was distorted, its features twisted with pain. The woman's eyes seemed to follow Lena as she moved, a desperate, pleading look etched into her face. Then, the reflection changed. The woman in the mirror started to move, her hands reaching out as though trying to break free. The mirror began to crack, splitting down the center with an ominous sound. The woman's scream echoed in the room, louder now, as if it was coming from behind the glass. "Help me! You have to help me!" she screamed. Suddenly the mirror shattered with a deafening crash, sending shards of glass flying across the room. Lena gasped. Her breath caught in her throat as she stumbled back, unable to move. She was paralyzed by fear, watching as something emerged from the broken mirror. The woman's form slowly took shape in the room, her body twisted and malformed, as though she had been trapped for years. With a sudden, violent motion, the woman lunged at Lena, her hands reaching for her throat. Lena screamed, but the sound was drowned out by the woman's relentless wail. She could feel the cold fingers wrapping around her neck, squeezing tighter and tighter. The room spun around her, and the woman's scream became one with her own. Lena fought, her vision blurring as she struggled to break free, but it was no use. Her breath grew shallow, her strength fading, as the woman's scream consumed her, filling every corner of the house. And just before the darkness overtook her, Lena heard a final whisper, a voice from somewhere deep inside the house, saying, "It's too late. The scream never ends." The next morning, the townspeople found the house abandoned once again, the windows dark and silent. Lena was never seen again. But every night, if you stand close enough to the old house, you can still hear the screams, the same desperate cries for help, echoing through the empty halls, searching for someone to release them from their torment. And if you listen long enough, you might just hear the faint sound of footsteps following behind you, echoing in the silence. It all started with a photo I never took. It was a quiet Saturday evening. I had just finished organizing the hundreds of pictures stored on my phone. I'm the kind of person who captures everything: sunsets, food, pets, candid shots of friends. Each picture was a little fragment of my life, neatly cataloged into albums. That night, as I was scrolling through a folder marked Recent Memories, a photo stopped me cold. It was a picture of me, but I didn't take it. I was sitting at my desk, the soft glow of my laptop illuminating my face. The angle of the photo was unsettling, like it had been taken from just behind my shoulder. My eyes were fixed on the screen, unaware of whoever, or whatever, was standing there. A chill ran down my spine. I lived alone. I stared at the photo, trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was a glitch, I thought. Phones sometimes auto-take pictures if you tap the wrong setting. But even as I tried to convince myself, the uneasy feeling wouldn't go away. I locked my doors and windows, checked every room, and even peeked under the bed. The apartment was empty. Satisfied I was alone, I deleted the picture. The next day, I had almost convinced myself it had been a weird fluke. Life went on as usual. But that night, as I was settling into bed, my phone buzzed with a notification. It was an email. No subject, no sender, just an attachment. I hesitated before opening it, my heart pounding. The attachment loaded slowly, pixel by pixel, until I saw the image. It was another photo of me. This time, I was asleep in my bed. Panic set in. I scrambled out of bed, my hands shaking as I checked the locks again. Everything was secure, no sign of forced entry. I called a friend, my voice trembling as I explained what had happened. "You probably forgot taking those pictures," she said dismissively. "Or someone's playing a prank on you. Change your passwords, maybe set up a camera." It wasn't the reassurance I needed, but it was something. The next day, I bought a cheap security camera and installed it in my bedroom, pointing directly at my bed. If someone, or something, was messing with me, I would catch them in the act. That night, I forced myself to sleep, clutching my phone like a lifeline. When I woke up, the camera was gone. I searched the entire apartment, but the camera had vanished without a trace. My heart sank as I checked my phone. Sure enough, there was a new photo waiting for me. It was me again, standing in the middle of the room, staring directly into the lens of the missing camera. But I didn't remember standing there. I couldn't stay there any longer. I packed a bag and left, crashing on my friend's couch. She thought I was overreacting, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The photos didn't stop. Every night, a new one would appear. Me at the window, me walking down the hallway, me looking directly into the phone's camera with a vacant expression. None of them made sense. One evening, my friend suggested we go through my phone's settings, thinking there might be a hacked app or some kind of malware. As we dug deeper, we found something chilling. A hidden folder. It was labeled Observer. Inside were dozens of photos I'd never seen before, of me, my apartment, and even other places I'd been in the past few weeks. They were taken from angles that shouldn't have been possible, as if someone, or something, had been following me, watching my every move. The final photo in the folder was different. It was a selfie, not of me, but of a figure I didn't recognize. Its face was blurred, as though it couldn't be captured properly by the camera, but its eyes, or what should have been eyes, were sharp and piercing, staring straight through the screen. My friend gasped, dropping the phone. The screen went black. We tried everything to recover the folder, but it was gone. My phone refused to turn on after that, as if the incident had burned it out entirely. I replaced the phone, changed my number, and moved to a new city. For a while, it seemed like the nightmare was over. But last night I received an email. No subject, no sender, just an attachment. It was a photo of me, sitting in my new living room, looking at my new phone. And behind me, barely visible in the shadow of the doorway, were two piercing eyes. I've always loved Instagram. It's my little escape from reality, a curated world of photos, funny memes, and endless reels. My stories were my favorite feature, a place where I could share glimpses of my life with my modest following of friends and a handful of strangers who seemed harmless enough. But last month, things started to feel off. It began innocently. I noticed one account consistently viewing all my stories within seconds of posting them. The username was generic at only a glance, and the profile picture was just a blank silhouette. No posts, no followers, nothing. At first, I didn't think much of it. Plenty of people make anonymous accounts to lurk on others' profiles. But as the days went by, the account's behavior became more unsettling. They didn't just watch my stories. They reacted to every single one. Smiling emojis for selfies, fire emojis for my morning coffee shots, even hearts for random snaps of my cat. I shrugged it off, assuming it was a bot or someone too shy to comment. Then the DMS started. At first they were harmless. Messages like nice view on a photo of the sunset or cute cat. under a picture of Muffin curled up on the couch. I ignored them, but then the messages grew specific. "Long day at work?" they asked after I posted a selfie with tired eyes. "Hope your walk to the park was nice," they wrote when I shared a picture of the path behind my apartment. I hadn't mentioned where I lived. I blocked the account immediately, feeling my stomach churn. It wasn't uncommon for creeps to pop up online, but this felt personal. I locked my profile, deleted a few older posts, and went on with my life, feeling safer, knowing the account couldn't reach me anymore. For a while, everything seemed fine, but about a week later, another account appeared. This one had a similar vibe. No profile picture, no posts, but a slightly different username, at just a glimpse. They followed me the second my profile was unlocked again. By now, I was freaked out. I set my account to private permanently, and any time an unknown account followed me, I denied the request. My friends laughed, calling me paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. One night as I was scrolling through Reels before bed, I got a notification. A news story mention. It was from an account I didn't recognize. Hesitantly, I clicked on the notification. The story was a blurry photo of my apartment building. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. The caption was simple, "Nice place." I immediately reported the account and called my best friend Jenna. She lived a few blocks away and offered to stay the night. By the time she arrived, I was a mess, double-checking the locks on my doors and windows. "It's probably just some random creep," she reassured me. "You've got nothing to worry about." But deep down, I wasn't convinced. The next morning, things took a darker turn. As I scrolled through Instagram, I noticed a new post tagged with my location. It was a video, shaky and grainy, of someone walking through my apartment hallway. The video ended in front of my door. "Who the hell is this?" I whispered, my hands trembling as I showed Jenna the post. "Call the cops," she said, her face pale. I did. They came, took a report, and promised to patrol the area. But without a real name or face, there wasn't much they could do. For a few days, nothing happened. I started to relax, thinking maybe the person had moved on. But then, one night, I was alone in my apartment, editing some photos for work, when my phone buzzed. It was an Instagram notification, a new message request. I hesitated before opening it, my stomach twisting in knots. The message was a single photo. It was me, sitting at my desk, in that very moment. I spun around, searching the room, but there was no one there. My curtains were drawn, my doors locked. How could they have taken that photo? The message came again, this time with text beneath it. "I see you." I grabbed my phone and called Jenna, barely able to speak through my panic. She told me to leave immediately, to come to her place. I didn't even pack a bag. I just grabbed my keys and bolted. As I drove to Jenna's, I kept glancing in my rearview mirror, half expecting someone to be following me. Every car felt like a threat, every shadow like a lurking figure. When I finally arrived at her place, she hugged me tightly and locked the door behind me. "You're staying here tonight," she insisted. We spent the night scouring my Instagram, trying to figure out how someone could have taken that photo. Jenna suggested hacking or some kind of spyware, but none of it made sense. Then she had an idea. "What if it's not your account they're using?" she asked. We started looking at other local Instagram profiles, people who tagged our area frequently. That's when we found it, a public account filled with photos and videos of my apartment, my street, even my favorite coffee shop. The caption on the latest post made my blood run cold. "Tomorrow's the day." We called the cops again, showing them the account and the posts. This time, they took it more seriously. They promised to have someone watch my building and advised me to stay away for the time being. But that night, as Jenna and I sat in her living room, my phone buzzed again. Another message request. It was a live video. I hesitated, my finger hovering over the screen, before finally tapping it. The video showed someone walking up to Jenna's front door. We both screamed as the doorknob rattled. Jenna grabbed a kitchen knife and I called the police, barely able to form words through my panic. The pounding on the door grew louder, more frantic. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. When the cops arrived, the person was gone. but they found a single Polaroid photo taped to the door. It was a picture of me and Jenna, taken through her living room window just moments before. I deleted my Instagram that night, but I still don't feel safe. Whoever they were, they knew too much. And sometimes, late at night, I still hear the faint buzz of a notification. But when I check my phone, there's nothing there. Thank you for joining me on this journey tonight. I hope you found some peace and comfort. Before you drift off completely, let me know in the comments what time it is where you are and which country you're watching from. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories. Until next time, rest well and sweet dreams.